Okay, I'm going to get started. I'm chairing this session, and I want to welcome you all to this seminar on anti-Semitism on campuses. I'm Harriet Hartman, editor of Contemporary Jewry, and in a little while, I'm going to introduce the rest of the panelists. I'm sure you're all aware of and concerned about the increased volume and openness of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism on college and university campuses, especially since October 7th and during the Israel-Hamas war that's going on right now. Depending on where you are situated, you may not realize that this is a global phenomenon. We hear a lot about what's going on in North America, and we forget that it's also going on in Europe, it's also going on in Latin America, it's also going on in Australia, it's going on across the world. Many questions arise from this. Is this anti-Semitism something new or a flare-up of something that has been brewing for longer than the past 8 months? Is the global anti-Semitism the same phenomena in each region, or does it differ by context, and in what ways? Why is it stronger in some places than others? Why is it weaker in other places? What makes it stronger in those places? Is there a best practices way to respond to it or combat it? And many more issues can be raised. I'm sure some of you have issues in your mind that you'd like to talk about. And there will be things that come up in the presentations that you may want to hear more about. We have assembled a team of scholars and activists here who will present their perspectives on the current situation from research, from analysis, and from experience. We're going to, because we have 2 hours, we're going to give each of the presenters 10 minutes to talk, which is about an hour. There are 5 of them, so including what I'm saying, it's going to be about an hour, and then you'll be able to ask and to participate as well. You're able to ask questions as you're listening or even before you listen. You can put questions in the chat for everyone or the chat for me personally. I'm probably not going to be looking at my email, so don't email me. Just use the chat and let me organize the questions as I see fit. Okay, I see that someone does not have sound. Several of you don't have sound. We do have Elizabeth here who I hope can work on that.
It's probably an issue, like an individual issue, because there's the issue was resolved for Dr. Kaufman, so I think we can go on, and I'll see it individual.
Okay. I do see that there's a question on whether this is being recorded and you'll be able to watch it later because you can't stay for the whole thing. The answer is yes. Okay, so stay as long as you can, and then afterwards you can make up the rest. Time is a problem. I asked all the panelists to condense what they had to, the main points of what they wanted to bring to you, to 10 minutes. And I'm hearing from most of them that that is nearly impossible. So I'm going to be a little bit flexible. It's not because I'm not looking at the time, but because I want them to have a fair share, and you'll be able to participate after. I'm going to give a brief introduction to each of the panelists so you'll know who you're listening to when. And then I'll turn it over to them. So our first speaker is Matthew Bokser. He's an assistant research professor at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute at Brandeis University. His research varies widely and includes the sociodemography and social psychology of the Jewish community, altruistic behaviors and preferences, Israeli studies, formal and informal Jewish education, and anti-Semitism. He's a member of the National Advisory Board of the Center for Small-Town Jewish Life at Colby College, and he recently received the Distinguished Early Career Award from ASSJ, the Association for Social Scientific Study of Judaism, which is sponsoring this webinar. Our second speaker is Dany Kranz. She's the incumbent DAAD Humboldt Chair at El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, and an applied anthropologist and director of Two Forces Consulting in Germany and Israel. Her experience covers migration, integration, ethnicity, law, statelessness, political life, organizations, memory cultures, and politics, as well as cultural heritage and allo-Semitism in the shape of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. She's a consultant to the High Commissioner of the German government for Jewish life and in the fight against anti-Semitism, and a range of other foundations, museums, and non-governmental organizations. Randal Schnoor is a sociologist, has been teaching Jewish studies and religious studies at York University since 2004. His most recent work is a co-edited book with Robert Brim, The Ever-Dying People, Canada's Jews in Comparative Perspective, which came out last year. Schnoor served as president of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies for 9 years. For the last few years, Dr. Schnoor has been teaching a course at York entitled Anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Canada. Under difficult circumstances, Professor Schnoor's course has succeeded in fostering a healthy environment for honest and respectful discussion between Jews and Muslims, one of the few places in the country where such engagement and learning has continued to happen. In the fall of 2023, upon the start of the Israeli-Hamas war, he helped revitalize York's only Israel-Palestinian student dialogue group, Bridging the Gap, which had laid dormant since the onset of the COVID pandemic. And he'll be talking about those things in his presentation. Judit Bokser Liwerant is the president of ASSJ. She recently received the highest academic honor as Professor Emerita at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, which I don't know how to pronounce, but that's where she is. She's a member of the Mexican Academy of Science and the National Research System, and a distinguished visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She's the director and chief editor of the Mexican Journal of Political Science and Social Sciences, co-editor of the book series Jewish Identities in a Changing World, and co-editor of the coming Encyclopedia of Jews in Latin America. She has been a member of the Citizen Commission Against Discrimination, in charge of elaborating the national law to fight discrimination, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. She also has been a member of the Human Rights Commission and the National Council to Prevent Discrimination, and has been honored with a Life Achievement Award from the Journal of Study in Anti-Semitism and the Marshall Square Award from the ASSJ, among others. Sergio DellaPergola was not able to be with us today, but we were planning on him. And so he was kind enough to record his remarks and we will hear from him as well. He was born in Italy and made Aliyah to Israel in 1966. He's Professor Emeritus and former chairman of the A. Hartman Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's author or editor of numerous books and over 300 papers on Jewish population and social issues in the diaspora and in Israel. He's also the winner of the Scler Award for Distinguished Achievement from ASSJ and the Landau Prize for Demography and Migration. He's consultant of Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics and many national and international organizations. He's a member of Yad Vashem's Committee for the Righteous of the Nations. Although he won't be here to answer questions, put up your questions and I will see to it that he gets them if they're specific to him, and if they're more general, then we'll address them as the panel. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Harriet. Let me get my screen share started. So with any luck, everyone should now be able to see my screen. And fair warning, every time I talk about anti-Semitism, it sounds depressing to me. I don't mean it to be, but it's just the nature of the subject. My standard lecture on anti-Semitism in the contemporary US is all about how we've exaggerated the threat in some ways while missing just how dangerous it can be in others, and that it's the price we pay for existing as a minority in the United States, but there are circumstances that vary with current events and by place in which it's far more threatening. I don't have any reason to think it's different on college campuses than it is in the general society, largely because as a professor's kid, I've spent literally my entire life on college campuses. And if there's anything I've learned from growing up in academia, it's that our campuses are largely a reflection of the world around them. Education is not a shield against anti-Semitism. Both hatred and tolerance exist in every demographic group. But before I get into the data, let me forestall some of the inevitable disbelief at my argument. Bad and worse are relative terms. When I say the situation on US college campuses is not as bad as you think, that doesn't mean it isn't bad, only that I think there's an element of exaggeration to the degree of the threat in general, while individual campuses may indeed be just as bad as you think, or even worse. I grew up in a small Jewish community with plenty of literal Nazis and radical Catholics who didn't accept Vatican II, but did think that I had personally nailed Jesus to the cross. That left me with a different internal system of measuring bad and worse than most people. Your mileage may vary. If you consider, for example, a post-October 7th survey from the Chicago Project on Security and Threats that reported 56% of Jewish students on US campuses felt in personal danger as a consequence of the conflict. That's an alarming finding, unquestionably bad. But it's not so different from a finding reported by Jewish on Campus and the World Jewish Congress before October 7th, that 45% of Jewish students felt anti-Semitism was a threat at their universities. So is the discrepancy between pre and post October 7th not so bad because you might expect conditions to deteriorate massively after October 7th, given everything that you've seen in the press and congressional testimony and on your own campuses and in your own neighborhoods? Or is it worse than you thought because the starting point was already deeply alarming, but maybe didn't get as much attention as it should? I think it's actually a little of both. I have a pretty good grasp for numbers and still find all of this confusing, so I'm going to spend the next several minutes trying to confuse you as well. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to take you through decades of data, but here's the al regel achat standing on one foot summary about the general status of Jews in the United States. We have the highest net favorability of any religious group in the entire country and have either been at the top of the rankings or statistically indistinguishable from the top for more than 3 decades. And despite some of the stories we hear, Jews are well liked across ages, genders, races, socioeconomic statuses, and political orientations. We are quite simply the best loved religious group in the United States. We are also the most hated religious group in the United States. And if that sounds like a contradiction, I assure you it's not. This table may be a little bit difficult to read. It's a lot of small print numbers, and I copied it from a report where its formatting is a little bit odd. But the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, has helpfully compiled FBI tracking data of hate crimes motivated by religious bias between 1991 and 2021. In that time, you can see that the number of anti-Jewish hate crimes ranges from a low of 616 in 2014 to a high of 1,141 in 1993. That's right. For much of the 2000s, the numbers were declining. But we have a common narrative in the United States Jewish community about rising anti-Semitism, and the hate crime statistics would seem to confirm the narrative, at least over the past decade. The number of hate crimes is on an upward trend. Not shown in this table, the number exploded to 1,122 in 2022, and the 2023 data aren't available yet, but based on what I saw in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I'd expect to see a record number for 2023, and we will almost certainly break the record yet again in 2024. But part of why the numbers are increasing is that we were at a record low. These numbers rise and fall periodically, and sadly, we're in the middle of a period where the numbers are rising. Now, a caveat, these data aren't perfect. Not every jurisdiction properly reports hate crimes, and those that do don't always make accurate assessments of what constitutes a hate crime or even a crime at all. And some jurisdictions are motivated to underreport data, including, for example, colleges and universities, which are required under the Jean Cleary Act, a federal law, to report campus crime data, including hate crimes motivated by religious bias. You can see here I've taken some screenshots of headlines accusing Northwestern University and the University of Oregon of exactly this. Now, without specifically accusing any campus, including Northwestern and Oregon, those are just two about whom I found I had screen grabs readily available while I was making these slides yesterday. But without specifically accusing anyone, universities might be motivated to violate the Cleary Act because high crime rate numbers can interfere with their efforts to improve their college rankings, which has been a source of plenty of scandals in recent years. But hate crime data are still a useful barometer of at least the most extreme forms of anti-Semitism in the world around us. And you can see on the left side of the screen, although the number of hate crimes at US schools and on college campuses ebbs and flows, just like the overall hate crime numbers, the recent numbers are trending upward. The numbers were low in 2020 because so many campuses were closed due to the pandemic. And it seems the bigots felt they had some catching up to do because they've been making up for it ever since. And although I haven't had time to dig deeper, I think it's reasonable to assume that just as Jews are the targets in about half of all hate crimes in the United States that are motivated by religious bias, it is likely that we are the targets in about half of such hate crimes on college campuses, and maybe even a bit more than that, given that we are significantly overrepresented in the population that occupies college campuses. And related, it's also worth considering that some of the campuses we've heard the most about this year in the context of struggling or failing to contend with anti-Semitism on campus, I'm talking about CUNY, Columbia, UCLA, Northwestern, Harvard, and so on. These campuses are in or near cities where anti-Semitic hate crimes were already increasing in frequency before October 7th. But the numbers were still relatively low in most cities. Anything over 0 is too many hate crimes. And it's been 17 years since I last taught criminal justice and was particularly well-versed in relative crime rates. But even with the trend line moving in the wrong direction overall, and all of the caveats on data quality, given the relative sizes of these Jewish communities and the size of the overall population in the surrounding communities, I'm not too alarmed by the numbers in most cities. That's probably not a popular view, but I think it's not uncommon among small town Jews like me who experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. I personally am not alarmed by the apparent rise in anti-Semitism because for me, it's not actually much of a rise. This was always there, simmering just under the surface, waiting for something to set it off. And unfortunately, recent years have seen a lot of somethings to set it off. It's not so much an increase in anti-Semitism per se, as it is an increase in visible or open anti-Semitism, which is a different sort of problem, in some ways a worse problem. But to me, the degree of anti-Semitism is not really worse than it's always been, because it's always been bad. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't circle back to the Clery Act. Every college and university in the United States has to report on hate crimes on and adjacent to their campuses. So if you find these numbers alarming, it may be comforting to look up the latest numbers at your own campus. So for example, it's been a few years since Brandeis reported any hate crimes of any sort, but Harvard reported 4 hate crimes motivated by racial bias at their main campus in 2022, and 1 motivated by sexual orientation bias, but none motivated by religious bias. And Hunter College, part of the CUNY system, shows all reported incidents from the current academic year on their website. As of yesterday, they were showing 8 bias incidents, including 5 hate crimes, and religion shows up as a factor in 7 of the 8 incidents. Which religion isn't shared on the website? I'm sure I could find it with a little bit more digging, but I don't think anyone wants to bet on how often Jews were the targets. Finally, if you turn to recent surveys of Jewish students on college campuses or of American Jews more generally, it is clear that something has shifted. American Jews have been feeling increasingly more threatened over roughly the last decade, both on college campuses and more generally. And October 7th and the aftermath ratcheted things up another notch or 3. It is not lost on me that even here at Brandeis, which the ADL gave an A on its campus anti-Semitism report card, one of only 2 campuses to get an A, there was a day back in October when local authorities told our Hillel director he needed a security detail. He'd received some threats deemed sufficiently credible after he discouraged aggrieved Jewish students from counter-protesting a gathering of a group that was apparently incapable of separating justifiable opposition to Israeli policy toward Palestinians on the one hand from celebrating mass murder, torture, kidnapping, rape, and brutality on the other. And there are campuses that the ADL gave C's, D's, and F's that say the report card grossly misrepresents Jewish life and safety on campus. And from my own experience with several of these campuses, and from what my informants on these campuses tell me, I'm more inclined to accept the views of the folks on campus than the views of the outsiders evaluating them. Even the campuses where anti-Semitism isn't a big problem can be unsafe, and even the places that are supposedly unsafe can be just fine. Ultimately, the discussion we're having today isn't so different from discussions I can remember having all the way back to the first Intifada, and I'm sure they long predate that era. There's an argument to be made that what we're living through now is little more than part of the same cycle of history we've been experiencing for several decades, where the baseline is worse than we tend to remember, but the peak moments of danger usually aren't so out of the norm either. But some of those peaks can be particularly outrageous, and this one, October 7th, comes with an appalling degree of gaslighting. Only time will tell whether October 7th ends up marking a sea change in the status of Jews on US college campuses or just another periodic spike in the data. And although I can tell a new and different story by tracing the trend data back over decades, to do more than I've done today, I either need to resort to game theory or I'll have to get political and my time is up. So I'm going to leave things there. I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say about the national context they're examining and what we can learn from each other that might help make all of our campuses feel a little bit more like home again. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Matt. I think I'm second now. I am actually working on Germany, and I'm going to share some preliminary data with you that my colleagues and I actually collected. However, before I start, as Matt mentioned some figures, those are notably different for Germany, and it's actually, I looked them up again to give you the most reliable ones that we have, because one of the key problems that we have in Germany is like we don't have constant surveys like in the US or in the UK. The Jewish population is much smaller. So the Jewish population, and that's actually Sergio's figures, are 118,000 if you go by the halacha and 275,000 if you go by way of the law of return. And when we look at anti-Semitic incidents, there were 4,782 reported to RIAS. That's actually the national body where you can report anti-Semitic hate crimes. So that's only the stuff that was reported, not what actually happened. And between October 7th and December 31st, those were 2,787. So it's basically nearly 2,000 happened in those 3 months, as opposed to roughly 4,000 before. The increase compared to 2022 is 83%. We did see as well a jump in anti-Muslim hate crimes. Those jumped up to 1,926. However, there's about 5 million Muslims in the country. So if you look at the population, you see how much more expressed anti-Semitism is. And the issue that we have with all of those figures is that the amount of Muslims is more or less guessworking, because there's no organized and recognized communities that the German state would actually take the numbers from, whereas when it comes to Jews, it takes official numbers and then you have the add-on work of Sergio. We don't have anything like that for Muslims, which is a massive problem. So I would say there's actually an overcount of Muslims and an undercount of Jews in general. However, as you see, it's a tiny, tiny community, even if there's 5,000 more Jews around. And one of the key issues, as Matt presented on the US, is that the issues of freedom of speech and freedom of opinion are legally different between the US and Germany. So there's specific anti-Semitic hate speech, which is legally forbidden. And if you are a professor at a German university, you hold the title of state official. So whatever you do must comply to the German basic law, which functions as a constitution. That made quite for some dismay, because some academics from abroad, in particular Americans who had been invited, were de-invited because their opinions could not be shielded, or could not be, you could say they were pretty much, they couldn't be voiced in Germany as they were. So we have a conflict here between different frames of reference. However, I'm going now into the presentation, as Judit is already signaling me. So if you want to email me, feel free, because I have to leave after the first hour, because I actually need to sit in a meeting with the government. So in terms of the local background, it's actually important to bear in mind that the research on contemporary Jewry is actually underdeveloped. There's only a few of us who do that work. We have no regular community surveys, and that the Jewish community in Germany is a community of immigrants. It remains impacted by the Shoah by way of a lack of privileges that stem from migration, and as well there's a structural marginalization that is ongoing. The research on anti-Semitism is still mainly historical. It's conducted by German non-Jewish researchers in the majority. And what a colleague and I, who conducted research on the issue of Jewish studies and Judaic studies, found very strongly, is that the research questions, even if you go in the area of anti-Semitism, is always impacted by the autobiography of the researcher. However, this is most often not talked about and seen as a very murky area. So we have those oddities in regard to the knowledge creation, and we have, as well as we hardly have any research on living Jews, there's an acute lag about them. The lag of knowledge has been replaced by ideology, and what we saw after October 7th was actually that anti-Semitism resurfaced very, very fast. And I agree with Matt, it was never going through a circle of more or less hate. However, the amount of hate that came out was pretty shocking, and in particular how vile and how violent it was voiced, and how little the universities knew how to deal with it. So we have one single study that actually looks at a university, and they found that 17% of all anti-Semitic experiences stem from academics themselves vis-a-vis their students. This study is pretty basic, and actually my colleagues who work much more quant than me were highly critical about it. So I'm fairly careful about how far we can deduce from that. Now, what we're doing and what I'm doing is I'm an anthropologist by training. So I'm working on an ethnography of fear and agency. I have to say I worked on agency before. On fear, I've never worked. So I'm looking at concept of fear and how fear is actually voiced. And together with my colleagues Julia Bernstein and Olaf Glöckner, I applied for funding in order to research Jews in academia. So that's our joint big project. It's a quant and qual project. And we actually broke it down in order to get the funding, because usually if you apply for like 300,000 euros immediately, you're unlikely to get it. Whereas if you break it down, it might work better. We do have insights already from RIAS, which I mentioned. That's the reporting agency for anti-Semitism, and from OFAC. OFAC is actually victims' advice. However, they do collect data as well in regard to the increase of anti-Semitic hate crimes. And these are the first, I would say, more reliable data sets, because what we have so far in terms of quantitative studies, the samples are very small. So my colleague Rakefet Salashek and me ran a small sample on Israelis, and we have 118 people who replied, which, given that there's 20,000 Israelis in Germany, is too small a sample to deduce much from. However, we did actually find out, or what comes out strongest in the data that wasn't particularly surprising for us, is that the place of residence is important. So Israelis in Berlin suffer, you could say, differently from those who live in the rest of the country. And it is where that students and pupils are over average impacted by anti-Semitism. So there's something with the schools and with the universities that is particular. In regard what I'm trying to do, so I'm working multi-sited with Jewish students and academics. I'm not working with pupils for the simple reason everybody under 18, it's incredibly difficult to work with them because they're legally minors. Of course, it would be highly interesting, but I leave that to somebody else. So the core question that I'm actually following is, how is fear experienced and how is agency expressed? And I can give you some first results of what I actually found. So the Association of Jewish Academics of Germany has been set up. And that's the first time since 1945 that Jewish academics actually organized. That didn't exist before at all. We weren't organized. Jewish students, as opposed to that, have been organized since 1968. So there's a difference that we can actually see. And one of the things we're trying to find out as an association is it's a very small survey that we're running internally, is what we want and what the universities actually want in regard to security, safety, and measures of anti-Semitism. So most Jewish academics find it completely disagreeable to be chased off campus and do home office, as opposed to the universities who very, you could say, happily offer it. And the notion is, if the Jew is not on campus, the problem is actually solved. And as we're only 140 across the country, you can see we're such a small group that if we're not there, for us it's tragic. For the majority of the population, it might not show that much. So it's a problem of outsourcing and what we actually want. So there's an expression of agency as opposed to what the majority society wants. And a shift occurred within this group. It's like initially we were you could say, a loose network, a social media based group, which was highly, you could say, pluralistic, but also particularistic. So discrete groups emerged and an association was set up. An association has the advantage that you have statutes, and those you must comply to. If you sign up for membership, you comply. If you don't comply, you don't sign up or you're actually out. So that was actually a means in order to become able to act and also to speak up. Jewish academics and students have been suffering acute isolation. As I gave you the numbers before, it's unsurprising we're actually very few. And the isolation spans social and professional spheres. So Jewish students and academics are actually targeted in person and on social media, most likely in WhatsApp and Telegram groups, which means that loads of discrimination, anti-Semitic hate crimes is something we can't actually grasp, because in order to grasp it, to obtain the data, you would need access to those WhatsApp groups, which commonly you don't have. And that also flies over the heads of the Jews who work on campus, because quite often usually the only Jewish professor who's around is not aware of everything that is going on. And there's quite some undercover Jewish professors whose fear is to be outed. So you see there's an actual climate of fear. And the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, or as one of my colleagues referred to them, the anti-Israeli hate fests, attract much bigger audiences than the pro-Israel or actually bridging the gap groups, such as Randal fortunately set it up. So in Germany, that thing doesn't exist right now. Some allyships have come into being, in particular in regard to student groups and as well to non-Jewish professors who support their Jewish colleagues. And the idea is to make the campus safe again, because at some universities, a level has been reached that actually Jewish students will not come to campus. And at other universities, cleaning teams actually enter the university before the university opens and removes all graffitis and stickers. So you could see on the one hand, the hate crime is gone, so the campus looks nicer, but the atmosphere actually hasn't changed. And for loads of people, what is actually in the undercurrent is not visible, but for the Jewish students, it's tangible. And that becomes problematic, because if you say something is tangible, but it's not visible, you lack empirical data, and then anti-Semitism becomes something you feel, but not something you experience. So you see there's a shift. And actually, to give you an insight into how strong this anti-Jewish and particularly anti-Israeli climate is right now, is actually a non-Jewish colleague in Israel who I talked to today. And she told me she was organizing a workshop. She got a very serious amount of cancellations because Europe-based colleagues actually feared for their careers if they were going to go to Israel right now. And others saw their travel applications declined, which is in Germany rather uncommon, that you see travel application declined if there's still funding around. So whatever the reasons are, we're not dealing with immediate discrimination, which legally you can target, but with intermediate discrimination and discursive discrimination, which is much harder to get. So this is the, well, I'm not sure how long I talked, but I hope I didn't go that much over 10 minutes. And if you like, email me, and I apologize that I have to leave early.
Thank you very much. You were 2 minutes over. That was fine. Okay,
Okay,
Randal.
can everyone hear me? Okay, good afternoon. I'm Randal Schnoor, and happy to be here. As Harriet said, I teach Jewish studies at York University in Toronto, and it's one of the largest universities in Canada. It's a very diverse student body, coming from many parts of the world, including many Muslims and Arab students, and quite a large Jewish student population as well, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 students. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground at my campus and other campuses in Canada, and maybe some analysis and reflections on what's happening, and about my initiative, which has been quite successful, to develop a student dialogue group called Bridging the Gap, an Israel-Palestine student dialogue group. So since October 7th, of course, as we've heard, we have seen a dramatic rise in anti-Semitism, and I would also say Islamophobia in Canada, and campuses are certainly no exception. I would say that we can find very overt examples of anti-Semitism on Canadian campuses, and then examples that might be open to some interpretation. And that's something I want to discuss. Overt examples, of course, are ripping down mezuzahs on dormitory doors at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where my daughter goes, or swastikas I've seen on the wall at York University, or examples of harassing students for wearing the Star of David, or yelling Hitler should have finished the job. There is no debate that these are overt examples of anti-Semitism, and there's really, in fact, nothing about Israel in any of these examples. There is also a dramatic rise of anti-Zionism on campuses, and that is to say a very strong critique of Israel and of Zionism. We are familiar with the encampments in the United States and in other places in the world. In Canada, there have, shortly after the American encampments, in late April and early May, encampments started on several Canadian campuses. McGill University in Montreal and University of Toronto being some of the more prominent ones. In total, there were about 12 encampments, of which approximately 6 are still standing, and 6 were closed down in various circumstances. So I want to reflect a little bit on to what extent these strongly anti-Zionist protests and encampments are anti-Semitic. And of course, there is a lot of debate about that and a lot of different perspectives about that. At my own university, for example, there are 2 Jewish faculty groups with different opinions on these anti-Israel protests. There is a group in Canada, which is very active at York University, called the Jewish Faculty Network, which is a group of Jewish faculty who are quite critical of Israel and tend to support these kinds of protests. Then there is an alliance of Jewish professors at my university who are, pro-Israel, quite Zionist, and certainly very disturbed by these protests and encampments. And both bodies have issued statements to express their opinion. Now, I have a colleague in Canada by the name of Robert Brim, who has done some excellent survey research just in February and March of this year, where he tries to entangle anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And he conducted a survey of non-Jewish university students, among other samples. And he looked at some of the classic anti-Jewish sentiments that people might have and the classic anti-Zionist sentiments that people might have. And he asked whether people agree, disagree, strongly agree, somewhat agree with a series of statements. And I'll just give you a few examples so you understand what I'm saying. In terms of how prominent anti-Jewish sentiment is, you could ask, Jewish people only care about themselves. Do you agree, strongly agree, disagree? Jewish people have too much power. Jewish people talk too much about the Holocaust. Okay, and there were 12 statements like that, and some of you are familiar with these kinds of measurements. And then you can form a score out of 6, how anti-Jewish that group is expressing in their attitudes. And then you can ask separate questions on anti-Zionism. Some examples are, Israel's an apartheid state, disagree, agree, somewhat disagree, etc. Zionism is a form of racism. The war in Gaza is an example of genocide. And there are 12 statements of this type, and you can, again, form a score out of 6 for anti-Zionist sentiment. So what were the results of Brim's study? To my dismay, the level of anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist sentiment was a little bit higher among non-Jewish university students than the Canadian population in general. So Matt says, university is a place of tolerance, but it also can be a place of intolerance. But the question also we can ask is, what was the level of correlation between the anti-Jewish and the anti-Zionist sentiments? And the answer is there was a correlation, but it was rather weak. That is to say, there are people with strong anti-Zionist attitudes, who do not have strong anti-Jewish attitudes. It is not uncommon. And the study that Matt referred to by Robert Pape at the University of Chicago had some similar results. Actually, he found even a weaker connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Well, is that convincing then that these two forces are completely different? This is a method of measuring the attitudes of the potential perpetrators. We know that there are other ways to measure, and a scholar by the name of Dov Waxman and his colleagues have produced wonderful research about identifying different ways that you can measure this. And rather than the perpetrator's attitudes, you can talk to the possible victims themselves and see how they experience these actions. A lot of Jews will say, don't tell me what's anti-Semitic. I know what's anti-Semitic. I know in my kishkas, right? I know in my guts. And so if someone says, oh, I have nothing against Jews, but Zionism is racism, but I have nothing against Jews, and they may really feel they have nothing against Jews. But many Jews will certainly take offense and will feel uncomfortable or perhaps even unsafe. So how do we know what these people are thinking and how people are reacting? If we could only get these students to talk to each other, maybe they could understand each other better and understand what they're saying and how it's being received. And lo and behold, that's what we did at York University. We have some outstanding students who had started this a few years ago, and I was able to kind of activate a number of students and met with them over coffee, one by one. It's a type of a grassroots approach, which I think is the right approach here, on an individual basis. And I formed a group of student leaders, Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli, Arab, etc. And we met a few times and we formed trust and we formed friendships. And that is the most important thing for the foundation of this kind of project. And after we had felt that we had that trust within ourselves, we started to open up programs at our university for dialogue. And we would have 15 or 30 students come, and we would break into small circles, and we would ask questions to start a conversation, such as, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What does that mean to you? It's an excellent question. And if people are buying in to the respectful style, the compassion, the listening that we're all about, you can have an excellent conversation. From that Chicago study, there is a fascinating finding that 66% of Jews on campuses find from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, to be a call for expulsion of all Jews or even the genocide of all Jews. As a result, many Jews feel very uncomfortable and unsafe with that chant. The research showed that only 14% of Muslims who may have chanted that chant also understand that to be a statement of expelling Jews and killing Jews, only 14%. So we have here a mismatch of understanding. And in fact, we asked that question in our dialogue group, and the same kind of results came. The Syrian student who was in that group was surprised to hear that Jews interpreted that statement in the way that they did. And by talking it through, we can have a lot of opportunity for more progress and understanding. So we're not there to have arguments, to score points. We're there to listen. And there is a tremendous appetite for this on campuses if we can provide the venue for it. York U is the only place it's happening now in Canada, but I'm happy to say that I'm helping the University of Toronto to do it now. What we've done is had public panels to showcase the work that we're doing on other campuses in Ontario and also in synagogues and community centers. And it's helping for the word to get out, and other students are becoming interested. It's starting on their campuses. And now I have so many non-students, just regular people interested in Toronto. And I'm trying to negotiate how to work with that too. And the last thing I'll say is there is something like this in the United States. It's called ATIDNA, and it's a Israel-Palestine student dialogue group that started at the University of Texas in Austin. And I understand it has spread to a few other campuses. I think this is a very healthy way to approach this terrible situation that we're in. Many people are suffering, are angry, are sad, are angry, are anxious. And I think this is a valuable way on campuses to try to lower the temperature and bring more empathy and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judit? You're muted.
Sorry. So I divided my intervention today in 3 parts. One, the more general, where I suggest to have a global comparative historical analysis of what we are living today in the campus as part of a cumulative process. The second will be what is the impact of the theoretical and ideological elaborations. And the third one will be a reference to Latin America. As we can see and we know, there are differences in character, modalities, content of the demands, alliances, but in any case, what we have is a global process that also has regional and national expressions. Although the volume of university activism today is probably greater than in the past, the contestation around the policies and around the legitimacy of the state of Israel goes back for decades, I would say from the 60s, especially as we will see from the 68 onwards, an ascendant place, an increasing relevance, and goes up and down related to the political conjuncture of the regional and international arenas. The global character of the movement, we have heard, we know, it is conferences, assemblies, demonstration, and encampments. The demands are a sine qua non condition for their departure as encampment, and they oscillate between the recovering the BDS crimes, cutting the immediate ties with Israeli universities, a clear condemnation of the ongoing genocide perpetrated by Israel, and a call for a ceasefire together, an end to the Israeli military occupation, an end to the repression, censorship, and threats against student solidarity with Palestine, and also a formal commitment to seek partnership with Palestinian University to offer position, scholarship, and grants to Palestinian academics. Well, it includes, as we will see later, some of the, of course, dictums that you referred previously. So they call Israel a genocidal state and call for dismantling Israel also. So the questioning started going back to 67, Then as the movement progressed, it went to 48, and then to 1917, the Balfour Declaration. So our challenge is to explain the global strategy that is anchored regionally and nationally. It is the campus, it is the street, it is the media. And what we see is that, and I would say, I will try to explain and present to you, that we are dealing really with a conceptual and political question, meaning by that, what is the relation and the difference between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israelism, because they are particular processes, but they are overlapping phenomena. They reinforce each other at the meaning-making level, but also in concrete expression. And among the causal factors that may drive the overlapping are hatred of Jews, prejudice toward Israel, the rejection of the self-determination of Jews, as well as geostrategic or political interests. And the possible outcomes we are dealing today. They include normalization of hostility toward Israel and or Jews, the radicalization of the discourse, a new threshold of acceptance or rejection, the delegitimation, as we said, of Israel, and the emergence of radical political and social movement, including transnational ones and violence, symbolic and physical. And the outcomes become particularly acute, as we can see today also in our session, because of the transnationalization of prejudice, the globalization of hatreds, the prevalence of new technologies, and the reconfiguration of social arrangement that lead to new convergences between seemingly different and even opposing actors. So we know that legitimate criticism of Israel is largely based on human rights violations and may differ in their origin, right? Maybe ethical, universal, cosmopolitan, and the outcome also may differ: public pressure, international accountability, all what we are seeing today. The point is, when we see today this outburst of hatred and the cancellation of the possibility to deal with it in the classroom. So when Randal referred this experiment, we see that today the open camp, the grass in the universities is the space where this can be, because in the classroom became very difficult. So what I want to bring is first an historical look to the coincidence between two processes that are expressed today in our present. I refer to the 1968 student movements and to a year before that, the 1967 Six-Day War, and the way they overlap in the meaning-making, in the content, and in the expression. Immanuel Wallerstein said that regarding 68, that the various protest processes, in 1968, represented a revolution of world system, that they cannot be properly analyzed just by looking on the local or particular circumstances of each of the places where protests are expressed and broke out, but they have to be apprehended in their global as a single global phenomenon. It is difficult not to adhere to such a statement, but I would say really, while admitting that in 68, it represented the construction of both individual and collective new identities, the redefinition of identity, culturalization of sexuality, the understanding of roles as social construct. In short, I think 68 marked really a before and after regarding the specific place and mold of thoughts at the academia and the university. It represents a milestone in contemporary history. Contemporary history. I'm impressed by the time. Let us take it easy, Judit, and talk without trying to struggle against Kronos. The year 68 symbolizes a process marked by protest and revolts, intense activism, demonstration, and movements. A year that seems to condense the unleashing of a radical imagination, utopias, mobilization, etc., etc. So we may see also the beginning of a strong counterculture and the emergence of contested and avant-garde forms of society, criticism of the dominant regime's political spectrum, an enormous tapestry of expression. Student movement became a part of a new social conception that differed and broke with the previous Marxist approaches, although it could mobilize the working class. France is an example. So, not having the time to express, I would say we had there Paris, London, Berlin, Bonn, Los Angeles, Rome, etc., etc. But we have also the dramatic experience of Czechoslovakia. We have Italy and the expansion of terrorism. We have the intolerance of Poland surrounding the student movement and the expulsion of Jewish population. And above all, and here I come to 67, in a generic and growing way, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism of Soviet origin. The Six-Day War of 67 altered prevailing political assumptions. And here we have really to deal with this. What signified was that there was a success of the West, so it was interpreted, to the participation of the former Soviet Union and the consequent alteration of correlation of forces. So, together with the Arab world, it started to be deployed an anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic onslaught that was threaded through the effervescence of 1968 and accompanied in an unexpected and virulent way many of the students' demonstrations in the States, in France, in Latin America. So for Israel was the end of the paradigm of Israel as what was called the Auschwitz paradigm, right? Israel as a state for refugee and as a state for people that were fighting fascism and anti-Semitism. And if we look, and this is what I did during this period of time, analyzing 68, coming there after studying 67 and 75 on, and what we see is that over there already Israel is defined as a genocidal state that carries Nazi-like atrocities, Gaza being equivalent to the Warsaw Ghetto, Israel being born as a settler colonial state, and we are talking of then and how today we receive it. So the victim became victimizer. Israel is expansionist, imperialist, racist, and it was increasing toward 1975, and there, as today, in this global process, I mean the campus as a space for expression and the street, the United States were avant-garde. They started, in time they started, and this is why we can express today how it came out and exploded with such a surprise, really. So I don't have the time, but it was related to the Vietnam War. It was California. it was the anti-war, anti-Vietnam movement, but also the struggle against racial inequality. And it was denounced the substantive role played by the white domination and expressed how whiteness was constructed. And we see that we had all the, I would say, spectrum from Martin Luther King to Malcolm X. And Malcolm X as a close correspondent and advisor of Arafat and vice versa. So here we start to see connections that the campus and theoretical were, but all you may trace back to 64. All this had strong influence to the South, to Latin America, right? That becomes also part of the civil rights movement, right? And the emergence of all the groups that we know. Recently, there was a very interesting, there is research that's called From Ferguson to Gaza, right? So how the Black protest and the Palestine solidarity are brought together in new spaces. Now, I want to go there. It was also the year and the impact of the terrorist agrupations all over the world. This brings us to see how it influenced the content of what was thought. And here I would say it is today recovered to the Global South as conceived as a space for liberation from Western political, social, and epistemological assumption, the harsh critique of modernity. The South, the Global South, becomes a conceptual and geopolitical territory where we have to see that expands to other regions. I would say my analysis goes from post-colonial to decolonial. I see the influence of great figures that are not the students, but the teachers of the students. This is the academia, what we have today. It is Mignolo, it is Grossfogel, it is Spivak, it is all this. I understand from you that I'm over the 10 minutes, right? So as then settler colonialism was defined, Israel was defined, it is today. Latin America reproduced what today Europe and in an intensity with a peculiar situation that in Latin, the concept of Shulamit Volkov, this anti-Zionist is part of a cultural code. It comes together with anti-racism, with anti-US, and without these antis is. Now, Latin America is, of course, a continent. Probably in the second part, I have with me the PowerPoint. I would like to show you that will let you see the common and the distinct of.
Thank you.
How much did I speak?
5 minutes longer.
Sorry.
It's okay. There to unpack. Elizabeth, are you?
Yeah,
Go
I'll
ahead and
share the video.
Great. And that will be our last presentation. Then I'll open it up to your questions and comments.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I am here virtually. I'm not here in presence because of an unexpected event at the Hebrew University. I had to represent the university at dinner. But I am recording, therefore, some impressions. And since this whole session is about activities on campus, let me bring one perspective which is somewhat lateral, but maybe of interest. I just completed a tour of 8 academic institutions in Italy. Italy, of course, is part of Europe, and it's part of European Union, which had an election a few days ago. The elections moved the center of gravity, the political center of gravity, slightly to the right. The left lost positions, but there was not a very big substantial change, and it is most likely that Ursula von der Leyen will continue to head the European Union Commission and government. But of course, there are differences between Europe and the United States and between the single countries within Europe. Italy has a long academic tradition, and I gave 8 lectures in different cities, very respectable institutions. 7 went very smoothly. I was discussing Israel and the Middle East, and I was also discussing a new book I've just released on being Jewish today. It's in Italian, hopefully will be translated later. On the 8th lecture and panel at the University of Venice, very nice place, the situation was very complicated. The audience was very quiet during my presentation, but at the moment the debate, the discussion started, the first word that was uttered by the first speaker was genocide. You are committing genocide, aren't you ashamed? What is your conscience allowing in this situation? And then the second speaker said genocide. And then the third speaker, who was a professor, said 36,000 killed by the Israelis. This is genocide. This is just to show what was the tone. Let me say that there were not 36,000 killed in Gaza. The number is frightening, but it is much lower. This by the estimates of the best experts. But the point is, A, the quality of the discussion, and B, the contents of the discussion. And the discussion basically points to the non-legitimacy of the state of Israel to exist. There is not a debate about possible solutions, who will take Gaza in their hands at the end of the battles. The point is really no Israel, free the space between the river and the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, this is, of course, very unpleasant. I do not lose temper. Usually I gave my answers. The hosts were very kind. This was not organized. The demonstration was not organized by the hosts. It was organized by the students and some of their teachers. At the end, the session ended with the apology of the chief organizer of the meeting. But this is to say that what happens out of the United States reminds very much the contents and the style of things that you are familiar with in some of the best campuses in the US. And of course, this brings me already at this stage of the conversation to an observation that these features must be analyzed not only locally, but transnationally, globally. There is such a similarity in the style and in the contents. I think that there is a sort of a unified vocabulary and concept that accompanies us through these days. And this is an interesting point. I return to the point in a moment. I will only say that, and I say that to my listeners in Italy. Italy is simply delayed 20 or 25 years in terms of the theoretical debate. Certain points and certain petitions and certain articles that I read during my visits to Italy were exactly the same texts and the same words and the same concepts that I'm familiar with the more radical side of the literature in the US, which of course points to a certain degree of provincialism among those who reach the same conclusions and readings 10, 20, 25 years later. but also points to the globalization of discourse. And this is, I think, a very interesting point. The second thing that is important for me tonight today to mention, of course, is the campus in Israel, which is where I operate usually. The campus in Israel, of course, is an entirely different scene because the people are involved personally. There is no Israeli, including myself, that has no people involved in the military or has lost dear people, younger or older, or their peers. One of my peers at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry has a son and a grandchild kidnapped, deported, in fact, to Gaza, and still waiting to have news about their destiny. And everybody knows someone who was killed in action and very close to the family. So there is an emotional participation which cannot be matched by anything elsewhere. But Israel is also the ground for a very active civic debate. And the campuses, of course, are political. Academics also are politicized. There are lots of initiatives and motions. I just want to pinpoint one, and that's the opposition to boycott. Because look, the boycott against Israeli institutions is really an absurdity. Israeli academicians usually stand on the liberal side of the range. They have participated very actively, most of them, many of them that I know myself, in the demonstrations against the proposed legal revolution that was suggested in January 2024 by the Netanyahu government. And therefore they cannot be accused of being reactionaries, most of them. And yet a boycott tends to penalize universities without distinctions. This is certainly a tragic mistake of judgment, and I hope this can be understood at some point. Some damage has already been created. I believe, by the way, that most of the damage is on those who do the boycott. Go back to Italy. A university withdrew from a contract with Israel. And it's clear that Israel was providing the leading technological contents to that contract, to that project. And so those who lost are those who boycott and not those who are boycotted. But this is the absurdity of being involved in these things. And hopefully this will change. The problem, of course, is that Israel is led today by a very dangerous impostor. I repeat, impostor, who has no public support. He is in a minority. He is governing single-handed. There is no government. There is no war cabinet. There is a man who takes decisions. There is a man who single-handed creates tensions with the United States, who are the main friend and the main ally and the main supplier of arms and weapons. And so this is a tragic policy which has no support at all in the country, but is very influential. And so while we object that, we are still the subjects of a democratic and constitutional state. And the situation, therefore, is very complex. The solution is to reach, at the soonest, new elections and to change the regime. All of the polls indicate the regime of Netanyahu will be beaten very dramatically, and though it is not yet exactly clear who will be the leader of a new coalition, and there are different models being tested at the moment, what is certain is that the current situation cannot last for much, because then the damage created is absolutely tragic and irreversible. And at this stage of the conversation, I must bring a final element, which in my view is fundamental, and it is again in the sense of the globalization of the whole issues. Look, we speak of Hamas, whether Hamas can be destroyed or not, physically or mentally, and then Hezbollah in the north, and the Yemenites in the south, and then especially Iran in the east. This is already by that global situation. It is a regional war and not a local war. No illusion, Hamas is only one of the components. But what is much more significant is Iran. And Iran is the faithful ally of Russia and a supplier of weapons to Russia in its infamous war against Ukraine. And Russia is a client of China. And now recently, Mr. Putin went to North Korea. And so we see there is a front on the east side, Russia, China, Korea, Iran, each with different functions, but fundamentally related. Much of the missiles and rockets that we see landing on Israeli soil come from Iran, from China, from Russia, from Korea. That is technically, from the point of view of the weapons utilized, this is already happening. More significantly is the political implication. And the question is what the opposite front is willing and capable of doing. The United States look, I'm sorry to say, pretty weak. It is important to remind that Mr. Biden, during the first days of the actual war, sent 2 aircraft carriers, and that was a very significant act of faith and of friendship to Israel. But now we see much less. There is a new chief of joint staffs who is kind of broadcasting a somewhat different message in the US. And then, of course, the more subtle penetration of foreign capital into the US. We are aware that many significant campuses are now significantly supported economically by capital from the Gulf, from Russia, from China. Research institutes are definitely under the wings of such capital. I think that also academic appointments are influenced. We saw the miserable performance of some of the presidents of leading American universities a few months ago. It is a display of weakness and of dependency.
Okay, I guess
Sorry, there is a
technical problems.
technical problem. Sorry, the internet is like unstable.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we got the main gist of what Sergio wanted to present. And now stand up and stretch, and then send your questions. I'm on you. We covered across the world, and we covered a lot of an analytical territory as well as both for what's happening on the ground in terms of the campus to be there, and in terms of implications for Israel. And there's a lot here to unpack.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I put into the chat the name of 2 organizations and the Faculty Against Anti-Semitism movement. The latter one is maybe several months their websites and consider joining. And I found one part of it very particularly interesting. You mirrored my. There are in the United States 4,000 degree granting colleges, and according to the ADL, there were incidents at 300 of them. Only one of the 300 they called serious incidents. Secondly, there are teen and college students in the United States, and I saw one estimate have been involved in these demonstrations and encampments, etc. Now, even if that number is really 20,000, it's out of 18.6 million. And the major thing that we're doing something about it, and I teach it in a course called Political Geography, it for 47 years. And the major thing is they don't know which river, they don't know which, couldn't find Israel on it, let alone Gaza. the vast majority of college just are ignorant of the entire situation. But including faculty who know very little about the situation, but are ready to jump all over and to support a terrorist group, is an indication, at least in some cases, that that is in fact done.
Thanks.
I think someone has their hand raised. Gustavo Guzman.
Gustavo.
Hi, good morning. Gustavo Guzman. I'm a PhD in history at Tel Aviv University, where I wrote Chilean right-wing anti-Semitism under the supervision of Professor. I have a question for Professor Bokser. Took place the Tricontinental where the organizers issued the very harsh statements against Israel. But not every Latin American signed these statements. For instance, Senator Salvador Allende, the Chilean, that, and the Jewish Chilean press applauded a great gesture by the Chilean socialists and the Chilean communists. And the situation regarding the Argentinian leftists, the Uruguayan leftists. I'm not very the Mexican ones, but my question is this: 58 years after situation within the Latin American left when it comes to Israel and Palestine, it hasn't changed very much. The world has changed very much for Latin America decades, but not when it comes to Israel and Palestine. So my question for you relates to the evolution within the political cultures of the parties. Thank you.
American politics and culture, I really need to defer to Judit and Dany.
I'm sorry. Maybe I pronounced it bad, but it's for Professor Judit Bokser was my question.
Yes, that makes more sense. Please, Judit.
Two boxers.
Harriet, you want us to answer immediately or you want to collect several?
You can answer.
Okay, so thank you. I think your question is very interesting. Indeed, I would say that there has not been for the left, it's not an homogeneous one, and it has ups and downs. What downs movement oscillates according to the national circumstance, and of course, what we say to the global. If you see the way they reacted when the case was brought at United Nations, see that there is a broad division and differentiation among policies. There was not Colombia. Mexico was escaping right from here you find, different resources. I would say one of the main challenges today, bringing it in from the 60s campus, is probably the empathy with this open letter by, Eva Iluz and her work when she wrote about this action, if not ruptures, between the left and these academics and situation. And therefore, I think that today, seeing it in the vote, I mean, the official policies, right? But on the other side, let me tell you that on the ground, on the student movements, Chile became the source of material that has been distributed in all our academia. This taller, right? This workshop that, yeah. So they have to circulate their material. And over there, we see, including answer, that there is some least participation that come very close to a situation. There are certain circles that they are more extreme. They continue the legacy from 1968. You will see there. So there is, we must speak or refer to the left as an homogeneous corp, right? Well, now Mexico, of course, is an exemplary case because all of, so I would say that from the 60s, the 66, right, and today, we have certain lines of continuity totally redefined, where you find sympathy, where you find solidarity, Chile, and for example, I said Colombia or Nicaragua or Cuba, to answer your question. And nice to see you. I remember we met. Sorry.
Thank you. There's a question. Adina, can you see it? The question of how we reconcile it with reality and our perceptions of reality.
Well, I think Adina, hi Adina, thank you. I think that some protesters don't discriminate between any attack Jews. But I don't think all protesters would fit into that category. Murky waters there as to what is an attack of a Jew and what isn't. If I know there's a poster that says F you Zionists. There's also a chant, all Zionists are racist, all Zionists are the so as a Jew or as a Zionist, can feel like you're attacking all Jews. And there are people that piggyback onto these encampments and use them, overt anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I also been quite an effort at the University of Toronto encampment to exclude and kick out anyone who's participating in these kind of overt anti-Semitism. I understand the change, all Zionists are the terrorists has now stopped. Didn't forget many Jews in these encampments. There would discriminate between Zionist Jews and non-Zionist Jews. So I think I'm trying to show that it's a little more complicated, and it does depend on one's perspective as data that we can measure. I think there's, a lot of questions to this. So react to these protests and encampments in different ways. I personally think they're the best way. As you can tell, I support encampments are not really set up for dialogue. That's not their strategy. That's not their paradigm. Strong political activism in terms of protesting on the street is embracing respectful dialogue. It's another political strategy. But I do respect that some people feel that, and that doesn't mean I don't think that there's some problems. A complex situation.
Anna?
So first of all, thank you. I really, I mean, a lot. I like Judit, and I guess Sergio talked of the discourse, and I want to come back to actually question to the way, which I really enjoy, Matt's, your presentation. You started by showing us a graph that we are familiar with, the Jewish American to be at the top of, even if we compare religious groups. And you that there's not a lot of agree with the ADL data of spike, because we already started, very, very hot. But I would like to hear from the other people on the panel, which seems or something that, living here in northern US, the kind of rise in solidarity that is, you gave a great historical perspective, the rise in solidarity or over the vocal pro-Palestinian protests. I mean, something that we see, we experience, and Jews, that is part of, maybe that's what's reflected when saying not feeling anxious, not safe, and less comfortable. How that relates to the new living with, you call it anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, both.
You're asking me, Ariela, me just refer to the very important answer that Randal presented to Adina. It is interesting to see today those borders. And for example, many of the decolonials are based in Mark Ellis' proposed in his work, reflecting the inner Jew we have and how we see the responses. So he distinguished between Jews of conscience and Constantine Jews. The Jew that is part of the relation with the empire, right? So the good and bad Jews, right? And how good Jews are distant, are the ones that are maintaining their link with Israel or Zionism. Now, what is this new going struggle And the struggle should be, in our case, academics not sharing the same position, to try to bring this reflection and somehow acting against the current. In as in mine, for example, Judith Butler is an excellent, but Judith Butler came out immediately after October 7th, Liberation Act. In your university, as in mine, when we responses, we see our students. I refer to humanity and social. Frantz Fanon, right? So Frantz Fanon became today again, probably didn't emphasize, but when I bring 68 and the sort of sacralization of violence, I mean, all the stories there, right? It was Italy, it was Spain, it was the autonomy, it was Germany, it was Poland, it was the Arab world also, and Latin America. But the common denominator was overlapping in between the violence. Oh, how do you say in English? La partera de la historia. To bring new life into us, right? I don't remember. This is part of what we are seeing today, criticizing the hidden history of the West, which is a hidden history where knowledge were outsized domination over the rest of the world. And the minority, Israel Jews, so therefore all the critiques, white supremacists, we are part of it. So it's a very overlapping images and meaning.
Could just add to that. There's a very interesting book that just came out, I think, by, I think the author's name was James Thomas. The title of the book, Folk, it was about W.E.B. Du Bois and his engagement and his study of German Jewry and the Jewish question in Germany, and from examining the situation of Jews in Germany to the color. Du Bois, of course, is one of the founders of the NAACP advancement of colored people, and he partnered with members of the Jewish community. Members of the Jewish community were very active in the civil rights movement 20th century and into the middle of the 20th century, and has gone away. And I think that's part of why we're seeing so much hostility towards today, that when there was activism to be done on behalf of other minority groups, Jews were too frequently absent. I am tired of hearing from representatives of the Jewish organization, Heschel marched with King. That was Heschel. Good for Heschel. He did a good thing. And never mind that was before I was even born. If we are not participating with these other minority groups in their fight for civil equality, if we are not helping them, then of course they're going to see us as the enemy. Because folks, we're not, well, not that all Jews are white folks, but we are perceived as white folks. Part of that white supremacist structure that is oppressing them. And it's understandable. But, and if for no other reason than that it's the right thing for all people and for all minority groups, do it selfishly. Groups and Palestinian groups are participating in those discussions. They're participating in solidarity They are in the room. They are participating in those discussions. They are having dialogue. We will, of course, not be able to defend ourselves. It is yet another that Randy is doing at York and starting to do with other universities as well. Important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also for the safety of campuses.
Well, sorry.
Campuses, I tend to look at this also universalistically. If if Palestinians are safer, then Israelis are safer too. Yeah, I may or if you want to just go on, or if Judit wants to add.
No, what I wanted to say, for example, is we should, if we do understand what has been all the ideological elaboration and transformation, we should, for example, non-Jews that can discuss with us these topics. Yes, we had I dare to invite Tirawe, who is a bright, enlightened researcher, and the conversation, I would say, enlightening. We finish just refer Shalom on Martin Buber, on how and why accelerate the political situation and change it instead of ending with the Palestine or Arab population. And he was not making any effort, but appreciating can be, I have to be sincere, not in the campus, but in the webinar, because in the campus, the risk of having all these eruptions, like the one that Sergio referred in Venezia, is more than probable. The times are very difficult. Zionist, you refer, you replicate it, right? I do have, when Harriet let us open it to other people, but I have several images I would like to share with you later if we do have time.
Okay. We have another question or comment from Robert. Can't hear you. You're muted. Oh.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, very good. First of all, thank you all. This has been, I'm based in Oxford, England, and this has been really incredibly refreshing because it's very hard to have these conversations. And thank you, Randal, for recommending the group. I've one comment and question, and then one just full throttle question. So the comment question is, a number of you have mentioned the dubious link between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and I think it's important to make. I wonder how you'd respond to the question of self-censorship on some of these questions. I mean, you're asking intelligent people who are well aware of what they can say and they can't say, and I can just speak of being in senior common rooms in Oxford for the last 30 years and knowing that none of my colleagues would ever say anything overt in terms of something that would be offensive. But that doesn't mean that people don't necessarily harbor views. And I know this for a fact because sometimes you hear things when they don't see you and people say comments. So that's one thing, that there might be a degree of self-censorship in terms of people where there is at least a bit of spillover from this anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and to Jews in general. And I think it seems to me it would be hard not to have that when many Jews so strongly identify with Israel, and Israel is so identifiably Jewish. So that's question number one. And question number two I think, Harriet, you mentioned at the start that we might broach the question of what to do. And that's one of the questions we are really having. With all this information, I think a lot of us have found the university administrations to be either impervious or non-responsive, or better yet, not to be inimical, but to be almost like does caught in the headlights. In other words, this has surprised them to such an extent, and they seem to be torn between what seem to be legitimate protests, freedom of speech, to things that they wouldn't normally tolerate, such as taking over parts of the university. The question I ask is, well, what other group would you ever allow to take over parts of the university and not react? Anti-abortionists, for instance, great replacement theory people, or even people from innocuous political parties like the Greens. The university, as far as I know, in our case, has never allowed any people to actually take over parts of campus, and yet now they're doing it, even blocking access to libraries. So in regard to that kind of stonewall that we come across when we asked our administrations, does anybody have an explanation of A, why they understand universities are so paralyzed right now, and B, what may be effective in moving them? Because certainly there are groups of Jews who really do feel very uncomfortable. Some of the students I've spoken to are really contemplating not coming back, and some of the students who have places at Oxford next year are contemplating going elsewhere because it just seems so uncomfortable. So those are my two big questions. Thank you.
We actually have 2 official minutes left to the webinar, but whoever can talk fast, please jump in.
Well, good to see you again, Robert. We just spoke last week on some of these things. I'll just quickly say, I wouldn't say there's a dubious link between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think there's a link, and I think there's overlap. So there's a correlation. It might not be as strong as some of us think, but in some cases, it's certainly there. We talked about campuses. Some campuses aren't paralyzed. My campus, York University, closed the encampment in 24 hours and brought in the police. And the one downtown Toronto has been going for 7 weeks. So every campus has a different approach. And as we talked about last week, I wouldn't want to be an administrator of a university because these are very difficult decisions and lots of pressure coming on different sides. And like I told you, I think a lot of them are trying to do the right thing. Maybe I'm too charitable for some of you. They're trying, but they don't always do the right thing, and they don't always know what to do. And I'll pass it to someone else if they want to add something.
I'd like to kind of sum up a message that I've heard through many of the presentations, that we really need to understand nuances, that each of you said, it's not all this, it's not all that. There are some leftists that are like this. There are some leftists that are like that. There are some anti-Semites who overlap to anti-Zionists. And there are some anti-Semitism that is not overlapping to anti-Zionism, that we really need to be very nuanced in understanding what's going on and taking into consideration that it doesn't fall neatly into categories or into the data that we have. And it's really a very complicated thing. And when we really want to understand it, we have to understand those complications and that complexity. And I heard that from several of you. And I think it's really important. Yeah. Judit.
You're on
Can't
mute.
hear you. Can't hear you.
If you allow me, and Ellie is close to us, I would like to upload some images that I didn't share with you. Are you there, Ellie?
Yeah, I'm sharing.
Could you
a second.
please, I am afraid of being schematic, but just to clarify exactly what you are saying, Harriet. And thank you, Robert, for being with us, and we'll be in touch with you just to include you in coming conversations, right? Okay, can you go? Okay, here we have, the two first ones, sorry. Can you go back? Okay, I do think that the questions we are posing are really referring to the different analytical levels that we are using and approaching, right? Because it has to do with if we are in the alleged center or the periphery, what is the West, right? The nation and the region, well, now it's black. I don't know why, but let us continue. I can see it well. Can you come to the other one? Okay, let me go to the other one. Here is my suggestion precisely of what you said. We cannot bring all them together. Motivations differ between anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, different from critique from Israel, and anti-Zionism, right? And I think that motivations and multifactorial perspectives give us a different picture, totally that is against an homogeneous conception. But there are terrains of convergence. Can we move to the, and here was my I would say, my effort to bring where we can see a zone that Israel, Jews, and Zionism were, when criticized, they converge. They converge, right? And this goes back really on definitions of being Jew and definition of Israel as a state and definition of Zionism to what I referred as a cultural code that overlaps with a perception of the Jew, right? And if we go to the others very quick, I would say here you have an example of the street and the campus that covered Latin America, right? Okay, you may understand, though it's in Spanish, no? Stop sees the genocide, right? And is mobilizing and is moving. I think we have another one, yes, that are very strong, as you see. I don't know, is our, if you come, you saw from Chile also, right? Then you have Colombia, which is very strong. Uruguay, Guatemala, Venezuela, I mean, the postures, the attitude, but there has been a regional coordination not disconnected with the world coordination. And this goes back, I would say, to the beginning of the 2000s. Over there, we saw in different well, I think from Durban on, we saw what is a coordination attack on Zionism, etc., etc. I think it's not, I don't need to tell you because the States also and Europe also has the phenomenon of Jews, colleagues that are Jews, and they are actively participating in the critique of Israel and Zionism, leaving us with a very non-real situation because we are really willing to find the solution. We are compassionate. We are not applauding Gaza. We are really sharing worries with what is going on. But then this is sort of a lack of empathy, including in a cognitive dimension, not only in the existential one. Okay.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody who presented and that is still here, and those that aren't here, and those who were part of it. I think we were exposed to a lot of ways of thinking about this problem and understanding that it's probably beyond what any one of us is imagining. And that's why we're planning to have a couple more webinars. So look for them in the future. And if you have ideas of what webinars you would like, send them to Judit or to me, and we'll do our best to incorporate that. So thank you very much, and have a good
Thank
rest of
Thank
the day.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.